Hello, everyone. I am Peter Cole, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event with David Jackson and Adam Mahler. A special hello to all of the Yale translation alumni who are out there scattered around the globe. And thanks to the Yale Council on Latin American and Iberian Studies, the Yale Translation Initiative, and the Macmillan Center for sponsoring today's webinar. And special thanks to Asia Nupane, who is our webmaster. Now, it's always a pleasure to be hosting events like this, but the sort of pleasure I'm experiencing today is a little harder to describe. And it might best be gotten at straight through the facts themselves, which involved our going back to 2014 and the first day of the literary translation class that I teach each year at Yale, and which is where I first encountered Adam, who was, not to embarrass him, but a fidgety freshman. The room was crowded. There were about 40 people in there, applicants for 12 spaces at the table. And Adam had cleverly nabbed a place up front, gotten there early. He was on my left, I can remember. And I can still to this day see the gleam in his eye under those very active eyebrows. And at one point or another, I think, as I remember, I posed some sort of translation riddle to the class, and Adam tentatively offered up an answer, and much to his own surprise, got it right. And lo and behold, he got into the class and we were off. And as we worked together through a whole thicket of translation issues, and in particular some freshman issues, I remember, not to embarrass him, but like this one, discussing what purple prose was and why it was called purple. I was struck as we did work our way into all that by the intensity with which Adam threw himself into his semester-long project, a translation of the poetry of the great Portuguese symbolist Camilo Peçanha, and in particular, work taken from his only published book, Clepsydra. And lo and behold, again, his project ended up winning Yale's first Richard Maxwell Award for Translation. So around the same time, he also founded the quite remarkable literary journal of the Journal of Literary Translation, which he cleverly titled Jolt. This is issue number 4, which is set the bar very, very high for literary quality and design ingenuity. And it's a standard that I'm happy to say has been consistently maintained by subsequent editors and editorial teams, several of whom are in the audience this afternoon. Adam graduated with a Fulbright grant to go to Portugal and translate the poetry of Mario de Sá Carneiro. And after several months, discovered that he'd made something of a mistake. He hadn't exactly chosen an author as one would or should choose a friend in the Earl of Rascominian sense. And gone was that project. But what should he do? He's in Portugal on a Fulbright. Back into play from freshman year came Peçanha, and that project began to evolve even more seriously. A year or two later, he submitted the book to Tegas Press at the University of Massachusetts' Dartmouth Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture. Tegas is one of the leading presses in the field of Portuguese studies. It's got a backlist full of names of distinguished translators like Gregory Rabassa, Margaret Jewel Costa, Alexis Levitin, and Richard Zenith, who, when he wasn't busy writing the magnificent biography of Pessoa, which came out earlier this year, or working on the new edition of his Portuguese Troubadour Cantigas, which Princeton will be publishing in 2022, was also involved in the project we're here to celebrate, guiding Adam further into the world, the work of translation and its world. Hello, Richard, who is with us in Lisbon. In short, or not so short, it's an amazing thing to have seen this project take shape from the ground up. And the results are really marvelous. An informed, poised, sonorous translation of a key early 20th century Portuguese poet, and one whom David Jackson will now tell us more about. But first, a word about David. David is professor of Luso-Brazilian literature here at Yale. He's written about an unusually broad range of works. He's the author of numerous books, including Adverse Genres in Fernando Pessoa, and he's translator or co-translator of numerous others, including Transcreation on Geraldo de Campos. He's also the editor of several important anthologies, and most important for today's event, he was Adam's mentor in all things Lusitanian while Adam was at Yale. And he has continued to work very closely with him since. He wrote the introduction to this book, and he'll tell us a bit about Pessanha now. So David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. You remind me of those days when Adam and I had fun in reading courses in contemporary Portuguese poetry, and his thesis on Fernando Pessoa and Omar Khayyam, which we worked on together up till 17 when he was double majoring in Portuguese and literature and translation. I had the pleasure of meeting him several times in Lisbon under trees in a beautiful park. And now he's a doctoral student with my colleague, Josiah Blackmore at Harvard. I was very happy to be able to write the preface for his translations. And now let me tell you a little bit about Camilo Pessanha. Camilo Pessanha, symbolist poet, was one of the cloud dwellers because of his dedication to the aesthetic expression of beauty in poetry. He thought of calling his first writings solitudes, deep impressions without reality of their own, partial erasures of the self, ecstasies and somnolences. Portuguese modernist Luís de Montalvor described his generation as descendants from the century of decadence. We go about sculpturing our art with indifference. Life isn't worth it for what it is, rather for how much it hurts. Only beauty interests us. Poet Rui Sinati calls Pessanha a nomad at a port of departure. A reader of Verlaine, Maeterlinck's Princess Malène, and the Portuguese Romantics, Pessanha graduated in law in 1891 in a state of depression. His early musings about moving to Africa, Daman or Timor, foreshadow his transfer 3 years later to a post as professor of the 8th chair of elementary philosophy in the National Lyceum of Macau, the place of exile where he would live for most of his remaining 32 years. His move to Macau followed an unsuccessful proposal of marriage to Ana de Castro Osório, who was already promised, yet who would nevertheless remain his friend through his visits and the pair's correspondence. Camilo Pessanha arrives in the Portuguese enclave of Macau in 1894 to take up his position in the Lyceum. He would soon become another intellectual outside of Portugal, a country whose greatest thinkers and writers had taken part in voyages of expansion to other lands since the 16th century. Macau would provide a context of exile, Orientalism, and exoticism in the period of aestheticism concurrent with movements in the arts in France and England in the late 19th century. These literary currents took Portuguese writer and diplomat Venceslau de Moraes to Macau in 1889, the Greek-Irish writer Lafcadio Hearn to a teaching post in Matsue, Japan in 1890, and Paul Gauguin to Tahiti in 1891. Paul Bontin embarked for Indochina in 1883, and his novel L'Opium of 1886 was featured in Portuguese bookshops 2 years later. The main character of the novel is a forerunner of Pessanha, a young decadent poet who sails east and under the influence of the drug abandons himself to dreaming and forgetting. Alberto Osório de Castro enumerates some of Macau's enchantments during his 1912 visit with Pessanha. Quote, the Chinese restaurants, indigenous theaters, the terrible Chinese roulette, houses of pleasure, golden and vermilion streets with fanciful characters, streamers and colorful pennants, and long spotted dragons in paper. What splendor, what suffocation. A gilded bronze Buddha whose ecstatic face vaguely smiled in an expression of transcendent serenity. Although Pessoa traveled within the sphere of Portuguese language and government, he was principally a poet who went into exile, choosing the most distant and exotic point of the Portuguese world, Macau, in which to change the rhythm of his life. His adaptation to Macau was mercurial. His first reaction in letters was horror at the step he had taken. Why did I leave Portugal? Bless me from there, for I am now all alone. My whole past disappeared as soon as I turned my back. Now I cannot go back to Portugal. I carry a large burden of suffering with me from so many people. And all around me, all this stupidity. Then in a letter to his father in 1894, he is more positive. I'm almost excited to write about Oriental things. Life here is full of new impressions every day, or else I pretend that it is, in a supreme artificial delirium that gave me the courage to leave and still keeps me from flagging spirits. The atmosphere in Macau is captured in a dedication to Pessanha by Venceslau de Moraes in his Landscapes of China and Japan, Paisagens da China e do Japão, of 1901. Quote, in the mishaps of Bohemian life, in the confused succession of days and scenes, it happens that the facts, things, individuals whom exhausted memory calls to mind little by little lose their intensive qualities, their colors, shapes, their very nature, freeing themselves from reality, like the page of a watercolor, cast loose and lost in space, carried by the wind, diluted at least into a generic emotion, vague, undefinable. Opium was an integral part of Besonia's adaptation to Macau and an aid to dedicating himself to poetry of unconscious, intuitive vision, profound feeling, and freedom from mundane life. On a visit to Macau in 1912, Alberto Osorio describes Besonia's use of opium, quote, the divine drug, otherworldly magic. Camilo smoked silently, taking long gulps. He became another person, full of life, of expansive joy. The poet himself comments that, quote, I lived in a state of convulsive exaltation that didn't allow me to rest enough to be able to follow with any curiosity at all 2 lines, no matter what they were about. In a 1926 article in the journal Seara Nova, Sebastián da Costa left a vivid description of Pessoa's daily life in Macau. Quote, at this hour, Pessoa read and smoked in bed, wearing a short camisole, hardly covering him, the sheet burnt by cigarettes. Beside him was the bedside table, also in the imperial style, with shiny brass fittings. On it lay a lamp, pipe, and a little tin of opium. At the foot of the bed, a small chair piled with books. From the canopy, with its ducal crown, there hung 2 fantastic tin fish. At the head, an old rosary that the poet told me with tears in his eyes had belonged to his departed mother, and he never left it. Venceslau de Moraes summed him up in a letter to a friend, quote, yes, Dr. Camilo Pessoa possesses the most finely tempered intelligence and is the subtlest of literary figures, although he produces little, explained by diverse circumstances. Pessoa returned to Portugal on long ocean voyages for 4 visits between 1896 and 1916, before his death in Macau in 1926. Pessoa described his, quote, miserable life as an uninterrupted sequence of physical sufferings, moral agonies, tragedies, and catastrophes. His reaction to the long ocean voyages bears comparison to Fernando Pessoa's poem, Opiário, in describing the tedium and nausea of the monotonous life on board, quote, to go on board a ship with no destination, all distant from one another, and in the depths of each one, my soul agonizes. This monotonous life on board numbs, desensitizes. From September 1915 until April 1916, Pessoa made his 4th and final visit to Portugal when his friend Ana de Castro Osorio, to whom he had proposed, asked him to structure his book of poems, which would become Clepsydra 5 years later. Pessoa's dedication to Ana Osorio on February 12th, found in a catalog of Chinese art he donated to the Portuguese state, describes his state of mind and alienation. Quote, to Madame Dona Ana de Castro Osorio, this miserable sheet of paper is witness to the bankruptcy of 22 years of demented life, lacking purpose, discipline, or usefulness, with long periods of apathetic dullness or intermittent excitements of isolated range among delirious visions, fantasies of other races and other ages. The edition of 1920 of Clepsydra was the work of Ana Osorio in Lisbon, assembled from the poems that Pessoa had left with her during his visits, and perhaps in some cases dictated to her, such that the first edition was not a collection of his complete works. Pessoa recognized and lauded her edition in a letter from Macau the following year, quote, I don't want to neglect thanking you for the publication of the forgotten Clepsydra and your care in arranging it, just as I myself would have done, and the orthography. Be assured that the surprise was one of the sweetest commotions of my life to see my poor soul, dead for so many years, so affectionately evoked before my very eyes. With the title Clepsydra, which is a water clock, Pessoa evokes both classical Western and Chinese culture in Macau, with a water clock whose design and workings the reader must imagine. The origin of his image may be found in the poem L'Horloge by Baudelaire and Le Fleur de Mal. Le gouffre a toujours soif, le Clepsydra se vide. Water is Pessanya's ever-present metaphor, a measure not only of the fugacity and illusion of time, but also of the emptying time of being, colored by the melancholy ebbing of desire and pleasure, measured by the water clock. More than a metaphor, water was Pessanya's reality. In his 4 return voyages from Macau to Portugal between 1896 and 1916, Pessanha spent a total of 2 full years at sea. Macau itself was a peninsula and 2 small islands surrounded by the Pearl River estuary. With the image of the clock, above all, Pessanha showed his interest in the depths of time as measured slowly, the dripping water indicating the archaic and timeless qualities of his verse, suggested graphically by the letter Y, at the time not in the Portuguese alphabet. Perhaps Pessanha used it as a sign of classical perfection or a reference to an anachronistic past. In a modern reading, the Y becomes an icon, a pure trace of a remote and perhaps indecipherable qualities in the verses. In 1913, the Macau journal O Progresso published Pessanha's Elegias Chinesas, Chinese elegies from the Ming Dynasty, about which he commented in an introduction, quote, "Today I'm delivering to the weekly a few dozen little Chinese compositions that I've entertained myself deciphering during the last 6 years of slothful residence in Macau, the first of my old age, hours of such smooth spiritual pleasure from which I never expected so much." Pessanha explained his method of translation in detail. Quote, "I translated literally as much as the radical difference between the genius of the 2 languages permits. I made an effort not to delete any of the ideas contained in the original, as adjectival or accessory as they may be, although at times I must sacrifice to my sense of fidelity the long rhythms and relative formal symmetry that I would wish to give to the translation of a Chinese quatrain, given the impossibility of translating them into Portuguese quatrains. Even less did I try to reveal small details so as to avoid false exoticism. I isolated the translation of each one of the verses to conserve within it as much as possible the original order of ideas and symbols. That is, I attempted to bring precisely from the Chinese poetry whatever could be brought, a substantive or imaginative element. However, the sensorial or musical element resulting from a very special metrical technique in which cleverly I learned resources of prosody that European languages do not possess is absolutely irreplicable. The translations are especially suitable for study since Pessoa included the original Chinese text. In conclusion, Pessoa became known as Portugal's most important symbolist poet, largely through the attention he received from Fernando Pessoa and their correspondence. Pessanha and Pessoa had a common commitment to beauty above all else, as well as a notion of sublimity lying beyond the normal human realm of emotion, thought, and letters. Neither was much interested in publishing. Both combined modern aesthetics with a precise sense of language, rhythm, etymology, phonology, morphology, and syntax, brought together to express uncommon states of mind, emotion, and reception. Alberto Zari de Castro noted in his visit that Pessoa was, quote, completely absorbed by the enchantments of the Far East. In an essay on the Camões Grotto, Pessanha explains why Macau fills him with nostalgia for Portugal. Macau, this tiny Portuguese peninsula in the China Sea, tied to the Chinese dialect of Zhongshan, the only place in overseas Portugal where the seasons are the same as in the metropolis and in sync with them. Midnight mass on a cold winter night, flowery Easter with the joy of new birds. In Macau, it's easy for the nostalgia-fueled imagination to create the illusion of being in Portugal. The person writing these lines on his many strolls down the paths of solitude has had the illusion, rather vivid, though lasting no longer than lightning, of walking alongside a certain hillside in Beira Alta, very familiar in his adolescence. Macau is the only Portuguese land overseas where up to a certain point, one can have the illusion of being in Portugal, essential to the exercise by Portuguese of their special imaginative activity. In Macau, Pessoa learned to live with suffering, which was allied with poetry and an aesthetic vision of life that pain made more intense. His intense, effective life of the imagination is paired with failure and suffering, as he confesses in a letter to Anosario, quote, "I'm absolutely incapable of keeping up an assiduous or at least long-lasting correspondence with the people I love the most. My whole intense, effective life is sustained by the memory of 3 or 4 people whom I meet from time to time, and among whom Your Excellency occupies the principal place. I keep an altar in my heart with 3 or 4 images, and I spend my whole life in front of it in uninterrupted ecstasy. Besides these few mannerisms, nothing truly has any meaning for me in the world, through which I have passed like a sleepwalker." In his last years in Macau, he is seen to be distant, fractured, abulic, opiated, and anesthetized by a profound anguish. Adam Mahler's translation follows the order of the 1920 edition, as prepared by Ana de Castro Zoádio in connection with Pessanha and printed in Lisbon. And I believe Yale's copy is now in the Beinecke Library. Now let's turn to Adam Mahler, the translator, and hear some of his wonderful translations of this poetry of such an unusual exile symbolist poet. Adam, good to see you again.
Good to see you, David. Thanks so much for the introduction. First, just a few words of thanks to Richard, Martin, and Peter, who are my triumvirate of translators and were instrumental in getting this book in the shape that it was. Peter also for hosting, thank you. And just a quick list of shout outs. I think everyone on this list is here. Katie, Christine, João, Alex, Caio, Inês, Ricardo, Leon, Matt, Austin, Isabel, Susan B, Akil, and any members of my family. Thanks for tuning in. So I'm going to start by sharing the text of the poem called Inscrição, or Inscription. Clepsydra, the 1920 edition, is structured in 4 parts: inscription, sonnets, verses, which are basically veriform poems of different structure, and then final. So here is Inscrição. Okay. Eu vi a luz em país perdido. A minha alma é lânguida e inerme. Oh, quem pudesse deslizar sem ruído, no chão sumir-se como faz verme. Inscription. I saw the light in a lost country. My soul is languid and defenseless. Oh, to slide away in silence and vanish into the ground like a worm. Statue. I'm tired of looking for the secret in your blank gaze, cold scalpel. Struggling with it, I broke my gaze like a wave on a jagged rock. Secret of your soul, my exile and my obsession to drink it down, I tried to kiss in a troubling dream, your lips on terror-filled nights. And my hot, delirious kiss went cold over the proper marble of those freezing, half-open lips, those reserved marble lips, harsh like a sealed tomb, hushed like an expansive sea. Phonograph. A dead comic performs his set. The audience roars with laughter at a stale act, which fills the air with an odor of dust and crypt. The record changes to a barcarolle, lilies, the lilting river, the moon. Beneath her body floats my dream, a swoon of petals on a swamp. Again it changes, chirrups, bitter notes of jonquil, a golden bugle, sounding in due time the reveille, silence. The cornet's gentle music falters, masked and soaked with dew, spring, daybreak, a rush of violets. When I turned back, I found my footprints still fresh on the wet sand. I re-evoked the fugitive hour alive again in my dull eyes clouded with unshed tears. Perfidious footsteps, why did you stray so far off course and then return to the point of our first farewells? Where did you ramble, a slave to the winds, circling around like birds in a cage until their dainty wings failed them? This trek going on and on, what for? If the tides must come to erase you, wiping all traces of your presence. I'd like to ask David to read the Portuguese text for this next poem so you get a sense of the different accents of the Lusophone world.
Imagens que passais pela retina dos meus olhos, por que não vos fixais? Que passais como água cristalina por uma fonte por nunca mais? Ou para o lago escuro, onde termina vosso curso silente de juncais? E o vago medo angustioso domina, porque ides sem mim, não me levais. Sem vós, o que são os meus olhos abertos? O espelho inútil, meus olhos pagãos, aridez de sucessivos desertos. Fica sequer sombra das minhas mãos, flexão casual de meus dedos incertos, estranha sombra em movimentos vãos.
Thank you. Images that pass across the retinas of my eyes, why don't you remain? You pass like crystalline water through a fountain of no return, or into the murky lake where your course ends in the hushed stillness of reeds and vague, anguished fear reigns. Why are you leaving and not taking me? What are my open eyes without you, these pagan eyes, useless mirrors, dull dryness of desert upon desert? Stay, shadow of my hands, you at least, random flexing of uncertain fingers, strange shadow that moves in vain. Frail voice that passes, that meekly rues, I don't know what hardships. You seem to be begging. You seem to be quivering, clinging to the walls, when at night you come to whisper in my ear, I don't know what sorrows. Are you sighing or speaking? Why this soft moan, this lament you exhale? You seem to be praying, murmuring quietly, I don't know what sadness is. Be your companion? I don't know the way. I am a foreigner. What about old loves? You perk up and utter, I don't know what terrors. You're fading, delirious. Any hopeful plans? You breathe a sigh, your last. I'm gonna ask David to read one more poem. This is the Sonete de Gelo.
Ingênuo sonhador, as crenças doiro, não as vás deruir. Deixa o destino levar-te no teu berço de bambino, porque podes perder esse tesouro. Tens na crença farol, nem o procuras, mas bem o vês luzir sobre o infinito. E o homem que pensou foi precito, buscando a luz em vão, sempre às escuras. Eu mesmo quero a fé e não a tenho. Resto de batel, quisera lenho para não afundir na treva imensa. O Deus, o mesmo Deus que te fez crente, nem saibas que esse Deus onipotente foi quem arrebatou a minha crença.
Ice sonnet. Ingenuous dreamer, don't destroy your golden creeds. Let destiny carry you off in your cradle, for you can lose that treasure. Faith is your lighthouse. You don't seek it, but over the infinite see it shine. As for the thinking man, he was damned to search for the light in the dark forever. I myself want faith, don't have it. All I ask is a scrap of wreckage to stay afloat in the immense night. Better you ignore that it was the same God who gave you faith, that God Almighty who tore mine from me. Viola chinesa. Ao longo de viola morosa, vai adormecendo por lenda, sem que, amadronado, eu atenda a lenga-lenga fastidiosa, sem que o meu coração se prenda, enquanto nasal, minuciosa, ao longo de viola morosa, vai adormecendo por lenda. Mas que a cicatriz melindrosa, a anel que essa viola fenda e faz que as azitas distenda numa agitação dolorosa, ao longo de viola morosa. Chinese guitar. To the sound of the slow guitar, the crowd's chatter drifts asleep, and I, in my languor, disregard every word tediously uttered. Nor does my heart falter, while the shrill, irksome chatter of the crowd drifts asleep to the sound of the slow guitar. And yet what tender scar does that guitar offend, making those tiny wings unfurl in a burst of pain? Slowly, to the guitar. This poem is it's worth noting it's one of two poems in which Pisanio makes any sort of allusion to being in China, with the vast majority of poems in Clepsydra having been written while he was in Portugal, either on short stays or before he departed in the first place. And I sort of wonder why this poem, and because he was a translator, and because he was so linguistically attuned to Cantonese and also Mandarin, both languages which he spoke, I sort of think of this as the xenophone guitar in the Portuguese poet, and it's sort of would be an analogy for the chatter of the parlor around him is sort of everything he despises about his life in China, but there is still this poetry that breaks through and sort of interacts with, plucks on his heartstrings. At last, oblivion falls upon my heart, irrevocable, absolute, wrapping it like a mourner's veil. Body, you may sleep in your coffin. With your brow smooth and your features relaxed in immortal serenity, sleep at last, longing no more for things lost or unattained. The clay you shaped into chimera crumbled in your hands. A flower blooms, meets your finger and wilts. You tried walking, the ground kept sinking until the terror drove you mad and made you drip with anguished sweat. And this poem is Final, the final poem that closes the 1920 edition of Clepsydra. Ou cores virtuais, crisais subterrâneas, fulgurações azuis, vermelhos diamantes, represados clarões, cromáticas vesânhas, no limbo onde esperais a luz que vos patias, as pálpebras cerrai, ansiosas não volais. Abortos que pendeixa, as frontes cor de cidra, tão graves de cismar nos bocais dos museus, e escutando o correr da água na clepsydra, vagamente sorris, resignados e ateus, cessai de cogitar, o abismo não sondais. Gemabundo a rolhar dos sonhos não sonhados, que toda a noite rais, doces almas penando, e as asas lazerais, na areste dos talhados, e do vento expirais em um queixo brando, adormecei, não suspirais, não respirais. O colors trapped below the surface, electric azures, homoptic reds, inert flashes, chromatic manias, waiting in limbo for the baptizing light. Seal the lids of your eyes, stop watching anxiously. Stillborns in museum jars who gravely furrow your citron-colored brows, resigned atheists smiling faintly, listening to the water in the Clepsydra. Stop thinking, keep out of the abyss. Regretful cooing of undreamt dreams who wander all night, sweet souls in grief, and tear your wings on edges of roofs, exhale soft moans into the wind. Sleep, don't sigh, don't breathe. Those were the poems I'd prepared to read for all of you today. We might have the chance to look at a few more during the Q&A. So I don't know if Peter, you want to take things back over?
Yes, can you see me, Adam?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So applause, first of all. You're really inside those poems quite wonderfully. And we'll get to them in a second, but first an announcement. For everybody who would like to send in a question, please send your questions in through the Q&A function. And you can do that at any point while Adam and I are talking. Don't wait till the end. I'll try to either work them in as we go or get to them after he and I have a little bit of a back and forth. But anyway, that floor and door is open. So send them on. Yeah, so Adam, I was really impressed with the reading, the clarity of the reading and the degree to which you were completely inside those poems and bringing out other aspects of them. And so I guess what I want to start with is that process of your getting inside those poems. I mentioned that when you were in the class, what is it now, 7-8 years ago? That was something like that, right? You you were completely obsessed with this work. It completely took over most of your work time from other classes, and of course that's something that translators know, of being taken over, being inhabited by your author or by the work and the words of your work. And then you finished that project as a freshman, and you did other things at Yale, and you started out at the Fulbright trying to work with a different poet. That's a long time. And then you picked it back up, and it became this book. That's a long time to sort of live with and without that kind of inhabitation, in a sense of being possessed. So I wondered if you could just talk about that experience of possession and how it's evolved for you over the years, over those 7 or 8 years. Yeah.
Thanks. Translation is possession, but with 2 prepositions. There's possession of the poet and possession by the poet. And I think particularly in those early years, it was more possession of the poet. A dead poet is highly portable. I had my slim volume of poems with me throughout my time in Portugal. It was sort of a constant reference. And I think in my own development as a translator, those first few years was more of his poems were a sounding board for my own poetic idiom. And I think it was there was more of an active self-translation going on there. And that's why the poems have changed so dramatically from 2013 or when we first started to work. At that point, it became more of a possession by the poet, and sort of the really vast toolkit I'd been drawing on, the homophonic translations, sort of these more out there tools. The longer I got to know, the more time I spent with Pisania, the clearer it was when it was the right moment to bring those tools into the mix. I mean, a great example is his sort of the poem that Pessoa most admired. It was called Violoncelo, which is this dramatic sweep, really a poem that prizes music above all else. And I remember speaking with a friend, and he said, "You really have to go all out for this one." And so the final product ended up being this poem that, on a straight one-to-one correspondence is maybe weaker than in some other poems in the collection. But I think that was the product of a great intimacy with the poet, knowing where he would have wanted sort of maximalist, a maximalist approach in English. So I think in that sense, the work evolved and possession of the poet changed.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned how much their translations have changed in all this time, and they really have, quite wonderfully. They were wonderful to begin with in their own way, but they did change. And you wrote to me a couple of years ago when you had returned to this project, saying how much you felt you'd grown as a translator. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how you see yourself, how you see that growth, and how it shows itself, comes to expression in the translations themselves.
Sure. We also have a nice queue of questions building up. So after that,
okay.
We'll get to those. I think Pisania is a poet of multiple modes. But throughout, you sort of see in his earlier work this more naturalistic style of verse or more conventional love poems. And then by the end, he's sort of really coming into his own. But there is a consistency of voice throughout the collection. And I think perhaps in the beginning, my own approach was much more case-by-case basis. The collection was my own voice was a little more diffuse and uneven. So I think sort of in your course, you always talked about the one thing, the salient characteristic of verse. And I think as that came into sharper focus in my own mind, it granted sort of lent an even quality to the verse. I think that's the biggest change. I mean, there's some poems that are basically unaltered from 2013, but then the vast majority were really brought into line with those best first drafts I had made.
If I could add to that, just one thing that I noticed is you now see the dramatic situation of the poem very clearly and simply. You read that came out also in the reading too, which is, that's a hard thing. You're so, when at the beginning you're so hell-bent on trying to figure out what the words mean and how they fit together and how can you make it sound good, that sometimes one forgets that this is a poem about something actual, even if it's the product of a opium dream.
I think that's just also very important in the case of Pisania, because he's sort of been, I do this too. He's the symbolist poet, the great symbolist poet. So much of La Musique avant toute chose that there is no sort of imagistic content. There's no sort of idea behind the poem. And I think betting on a quieter music gives sort of everything else in his poetry more space to breathe. And he is that poet. He's not just a poet of sort of sound.
Okay, you mentioned the chat, which I didn't see, so thank you for letting me know. We've got some great questions here. I'll just go in order. Austin Carter, who is also a graduate of the translation program at Yale, and a shout out to Austin, who just published his first book of translations, poetries by the Lebanese French poet Georges Shahada, published by Cave Song, a really, really wonderful book. Austin writes, I'm struck by the verve of these poems. They're not artifacts and they're not academic. You know I mean this as a compliment. My question is, what does Pisania have to offer poets today? In other words, what possibilities does he, in your translation, open up for English?
No way.
Always rely on your friends to help you out.
Rely on my friends. Well, at the very... there is always the cultural project of translation, and I think just expanding the repertoire beyond the wonderful Fernando Pessoa to include other more or less contemporaneous Portuguese poets is already a great first step. What does Pisania have to offer in particular? A keen ear. I mean, I think it has so fallen out of style to sort of work within the creative confinement of the sonnet, of a certain traditional meter, and I think Pisania harness that creative confinement to great success. So I'd say in that sense alone, he offers much for poets today.
Mm-hmm. Could you, since you mentioned the sonnet, Adam, could you say something about how you dealt with the sonnet in translation? You know, what they, with regard to prosody, what was your strategy? Because you made some changes there. Some things you kept and some things you didn't keep. And
no, it's a great question. I mean, for him, there's clearly, well, I should be careful here because he had sort of an indirect hand in the final structure of the book, which was mostly organized by Ana Osorio de Castro. But whatever, Clepsydra, as it was brought into the world, was structured as inscriptions, sonnets, verses, poesias, and final. So there's something, there's an organizing principle to the sonnet more than anything else for Pisania. I guess for me, what I noticed most across the, I believe it's 12 sonnets, is it's when he's at his most diffuse as a poet of image. And I think for him, he's taking recourse to this very traditional, very formal style to offer a counterpoint to this very sort of airy, scattered dreamscape that he's building. So in that way, I felt freer. I felt the sonnet as a form was more relevant for rhythmic reasons than for reasons of rhyme. So I did not go to great lengths to preserve rhyme. Sort of, for me, rhyme is this very capacious term that means high order resonances with on the end words. So to that extent, it's a rhyme translation. But on the whole, it was mostly about getting a fairly consistent meter, not syllabic like Pisania's, but 3 to 4 beats, which feels about right in the English.
Mm-hmm. And as long as we're talking about that kind of translation, Jing, just also a graduate of the translation class, just wrote in the chat, in the other function, asked about, let me just look at it again, what she asked about. I'm curious about the experience of translating from translations. How did you approach the Chinese Cantonese influence of these poems in Portuguese, to the extent that you did?
I think this also ties into Richard's question, which was, could we talk more about where, when and where Pisani?
Right. So Richard Zenith writes in, could one or both of you tell us about when and where Pisani wrote his poems, whether in China or Portugal?
So I think I'll actually start with Richard's to get to Jingjing's question. He did not write, he wrote almost none of the poems in the collection I'm publishing in China. There's a handful that have, date lines. In China, again, there's two references, neither of them particularly flattering to Chinese people or culture in his work. But he was, as a writer of prose, he did take on the subject of China, and this essay, Macau and the Grotto of Camoens, is pretty sophisticated. I don't think Pisani is your run-of-the-mill European Orientalist, mostly because he really does learn Chinese. He really is in full possession of that poetry, and can appreciate it in a way that I just compare even with the great Fitzgerald translating Khayyam. That was a much more tenuous relationship between his English and the Persian than between Pisani's Portuguese translations of Chinese originals. So how did it? Yeah, I wouldn't say there's really any concrete Chinese, Cantonese influence on the prosody of Pisani's Portuguese text. I will say his own translation philosophy, which David sort of sketched in that quote of his, gave me the courage to pursue a much quieter music and not necessarily break out the acoustic pyrotechnics. Because again, his reception in Portugal is Pisani as the poet of sound, which is true. But there is more to it. And again, I felt some responsibility to show to bring out these other elements. So his own experience as a translator, I think, shaped my approach to the work.
So, one thing there is that, and it's something that comes up a lot in our discussions over the years, there's a way in which sometimes you can get a little hyperbolic, not you, one. It's good, in fact, for a translator in identifying the salience, let's say, of sound here, of overdoing it and then dialing it back. And that seems to me a lot of what's happened here is that, you clearly focus, the sound is there. It's even in this much quieter iteration now, the sound is completely there as a kind of substructure of everything else. So that, in a sense, I would say you got the kind of, you did get things across in sound that Pisani says were irreplicable from the Chinese. You've done a little more than that.
Well, I do think the gap between Chinese and Portuguese is greater than the gap between Portuguese and English. But I think Stephen Reckert, who's a great scholar of Portuguese literature, called Pisani the poet of micro signifiers, meaning, sort of what he drew the most attention to is the profusion of nasal vowels across his work. And it really is true. And viola chinesa in particular, it's Yeah. There's the, onomatopoeic effect of evoking sort of the reverberant guitar, but there's also this no in Portuguese is the particle of negation and no. And for this very sort of ontologically pessimistic work, it makes sense that there's this no in every poem. So I think, again, this quieter music might be trying to recreate those micro signifiers, sometimes at the expense of the more glaring, again, sort of the fireworks that are going on in the Portuguese.
So I got a really sophisticated question for you. How did the viola turn into a guitar? Years ago, you translated as viola and then it ended up as a guitar.
Because a friend of mine with much greater knowledge of the Portuguese language informed me that a viola was probably referring to a guitar. So, this answers Ricardo Ribeiro asked me.
Yes, I see. He's got a couple of questions. Do you want to translate those?
Sure. So what impact did my stay in Portugal have on the translation?
Good question.
It's a great translation. I think it is.
Translation is a great question, you mean? It's also a great translation.
No, it's a great question. Ricardo, for those of you who don't know, is someone I had, we spent a lot of time together. He runs a wonderful independent news organization called Fumasa with the help of some other friends of ours. And he's sort of a big, I have many linguistic imports from his own Portuguese. I think it's funny because Pessanha is this very erudite poet. He's often a poet of coinages and neologisms, very Latinate. So you wouldn't imagine that sort of the lived experience of Portuguese would help you all that much. His is not a representative syntax. But I did find just the process of total immersion in the language gave me particularly heightened sense of grammatical possibilities, and that was important in understanding. Even just pretty recently, in sort of the final round of editing, there was this one line that almost none of the scholarship on Pessanha had made out, which was "Donde vais correr," which is something like "From where are you going to run?" So directionally, it's not making a lot of sense. But then it turned out it's just a pretty common regionalism in the north of Portugal. I mean, that's something sort of a living, popular pulse of the language, even in so sort of rarefied a work as Pessanha. So to that extent, it influenced me. And your other question, which is what other Portuguese authors inspired me in the process, I tried to read sort of around Pessanha. He was looking more to France for inspiration, so that meant more time with Baudelaire and Verlaine necessarily than his Portuguese contemporaries, but obviously Pessoa, Antonio Nobre were poets sort of directly useful to the project.
So Joe Murdoch, who was also in the translation class and now is doing a PhD at Duke, asks, she asked before, what if you could say a little more about what happened to that poet that you were going to do on the Fulbright? You talked about that, alluded to that before. Have you come back to that at all, or what happened there? And then she also asked about the title of the book, and it came in the chat function. She asked, how did picking the book title go? Was it tempting to offer a more overtly interpretive one?
That's a great question. So what happened to Maritza Carneiro? I think there is a fundamental question of sympathy in choosing a poet. And I think maybe at the time it's very tempting as a translator to pick someone who hasn't been translated, or is sort of laurels have been placed on him or her for whatever reason. And I think maybe it was expediency that had guided me more to that choice of project. And whereas this idea of poet translation is possession, it was still Pessanha who was exerting all this power over me. I can't really explain what drew me into his verses and their vortex, but that was, I just kept getting sucked in deeper and deeper. The title, it always makes it easy when the title comes back in a big way in the poem, which is sort of his very poignant poetic sign-off, features the water clock, the Clepsydra. So in that sense, it was sort of as a exotically textured single noun. I felt okay leaving it in the English in that way. So there wasn't a real impulse to change the title to something like Water Clock or pick sort of a winning verse from somewhere else in the collection.
Or Time Stealer or something etymological. I have another question for you. This is one of those kind of stock questions, but it actually goes to the heart of what was going on. And especially with so many other translators in the audience, could you talk a little bit about what was the most pleasurable and most frustrating aspect of this project for you?
I think Pessanha offers a lot of what the hell are going on moments, and sort of, I mean, that can be thrilling to be sort of constantly forced to undertake these philological missions to figure out what a coinage means, or just what the dramatic situation of the poem is. But sort of, I think, entering his world in that way. He has long poems on putrefactive compounds. Again, he has, as someone who does not compose sort of original poetry, whatever that means, I think sort of the lengths I had to go to master his multiple modes were both the problem and the pleasure of this multi-year project. Also, just, you know, when you are moving to a country to immerse in the language, life does have a tendency to get in the way. And you feel a great sense of obligation to your poet. And it's particularly disappointing when you fall behind on your schedule, or it takes a little bit longer to get that verse just right. I remember reading Richard Wilbur saying he can spend an entire afternoon on one verse. And I remember thinking, that sounds pretty fast to me.
Yeah.
I think that was the big challenge.
Okay, so if nobody, somebody just sent in another chat, let's see.
Thanks, Ricardo.
So it's time for us to wrap up. I thought maybe it would be a nice gesture to hear one more poem. And the poem I had in mind, we talked about it before, Adam, is the inscription on the photograph, or
Sure.
inscribed on a photograph. And maybe you could say a little bit, give us a little background about it. It's a poem that I found particularly moving. And I may be wrong about this. It feels like a somewhat later poem, and I hear the emergence of the beginning of a kind of something closer to what I recognize as Pessoa, a voice that has more in common with a later stage in Portuguese poetry.
Sure. I was unable to find the photograph on which the poem was inscribed, but I do have a picture from 1916, which is when the poem was written. So it was a later poem. Many of the poems in the collection written 1895, as early as 1895. So let me just share that image. Okay. So the poem is Em Retrato. De sobe o cômaro quadrangular de terra fresca que meada no mar, e depois de já muito ter chovido, quando a erva a lastrar com o ouvido, ainda amigo, mesmo meu olhar, há de ir humilde, atravessando o mar, envolver-te de peito enternecido, como o de pobre cão agradecido. Inscribed on a photograph. From underneath the square mound, the cool earth that will bury me, and after there has been a heavy rain, when grass in oblivion covers my name, even then, my friend, this gaze will humbly cross the sea to wrap you in tender devotion, like a sad, grateful dog.
Well, go ahead. No, you go.
No, you go ahead.
At first, I didn't realize when I was reading this poem that it was his own photograph, but it's just, I found that an incredibly moving poem. The particular poise that's in there and quietness really comes to the fore.
I think, again, it is somewhat later in his trajectory as a poet. He dies in 1926. This is 10 years before he dies. I think what marks it as, again, I even have the tendency to place him too much in the box of symbolist, but I think what sort of marks this sort of foretaste of Portuguese literary modernity. There are a few factors. I think one, it's emerging, again, if it's inscribed in a back of photograph, it sort of emerges as the product of this literary correspondence, which to me is just so much of how, the iconic poems of Portugal come out of the correspondence between Sá Carneiro and Fernando Pessoa, out of the magazine Orfeu, which is this sort of fraternity of writers trying to push the envelope of Portuguese letters. And Pessanha was this sort of early 20th century troubadour. He was circulating his poetry, performing it at dinner parties, sending it in autographed manuscripts to friends. So I think there's that element of the circumstances from which this poem emerges that marks it as modern. And I think too, you also see sort of the game between sincerity and irony that really marks the work of Fernando Pessoa. I mean, this is one of two poems in which you can say Pessoa fakes his death. So there's a certain ironic play to that, but then, as you say, it's an incredibly moving poem of deep feeling. So I think that sort of gives it its individual edge.
Okay, so we'll end on that note. I want to thank David Jackson again, and thank Adam and toast him in the book. And I also want to give a belated shout out to another one of someone who was in the audience who may have had to leave at this point, but one of Adam's successors as the editor of Joel, Alice Yang, just today published some more translations in Two Lines magazine of Grok, who she worked on at Yale, and had some poems also in Asymptote. So, and Jacob Rahm is with us also, was one of I think Adam's immediate successor at Joel. So anyway, greetings to all of you out there, and Adam, really well done, and terrific reading, and good luck with the book.
Thanks so much, Peter, and everyone for coming.
Adam.
Ciao, ciao. Obrigado.
Bye.